The Christmas lights were still twinkling when 18-year-old Michelle Martinko drove away from her high school choir banquet in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on the 19th of December, 1979. Her parents watched her leave, worried only about the icy roads and teenage driving. Within hours, she would be found stabbed nearly 30 times in her car at Westdale Mall, her blood soaking the passenger seat where her purse sat untouched. For 39 years, this brutal crime haunted a community that prided itself on safety and trust. Neighbors suspected neighbors, boyfriends became suspects, families fractured under whispers and doubt, but the killer walked free, living among them, shaking hands at church, coaching Little League, running a business. When DNA and genealogy finally revealed his identity in 2018, it wasn't a stranger who shattered their peace, it was someone they'd trusted all along. How do you rebuild faith when evil hides behind a friendly face? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now, the 19th of December, 1979. Snow fell gently on Cedar Rapids as Michelle Martinko stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her best dress. At 18, she carried herself with the poise of someone who knew exactly where life was heading. Her acceptance letter to the University of Iowa lay on her desk, and her choir director had already spoken about scholarship possibilities. Tonight was the winter banquet, a celebration of their successful fall concert season. "You look beautiful, honey," her mother called from downstairs. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and the lingering warmth of dinner rolls. Michelle grabbed her purse, checking that the envelope of babysitting money was still inside. She'd been saving for months for a winter coat she'd spotted at the mall, something stylish enough for college but practical for Iowa winters. Tonight, after the banquet, she planned to finally take it off layaway. Her father looked up from his newspaper as she came downstairs. "Drive careful now. Those roads look slick." "I will, Dad." She kissed both parents goodbye, the choir program tucked safely in her coat pocket. The last time they would see their daughter alive was through the front window, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she backed out of the driveway. The banquet at the country club buzzed with teenage excitement and parental pride. Michelle sat with her closest friends, laughing over inside jokes about their demanding choir director and speculation about prom dates still months away. She was radiant that night. Several classmates would later remember her bright smile and the way she encouraged a nervous sophomore before his solo performance. At 9:30 p.m., Michelle hugged her friends goodbye and stepped into the cold December air. The drive to Westdale Mall took only 15 minutes, but it felt longer as she navigated the increasingly icy streets. The mall parking lot was nearly empty. Most last-minute Christmas shoppers had already headed home to warm houses and hot cocoa. Inside, the coat waited exactly where she'd left it on layaway 3 months earlier. Michelle fingered the envelope in her purse, calculating the remaining balance. She had enough money, but something held her back. Maybe it was the practical voice of her parents, always cautioning about unnecessary expenses. Maybe it was the uncertainty that comes with being 18 and standing on the threshold of everything unknown. "I'll come back tomorrow," she told the sales clerk, though they both knew the mall would be chaos with last-minute shoppers. "Hold it for me one more day?" The clerk nodded, updating the layaway card with tomorrow's date. Michelle walked back through the nearly empty mall, her footsteps echoing off the polished floors. A few security guards nodded as she passed, and the elderly man at the pretzel stand waved goodnight. Normal interactions on self-danded video, what should have been a normal evening. Outside, the cold bit through her thin jacket, the very reason she'd been saving for the warmer coat. She walked quickly to her car, keys ready, purse clutched close. The parking lot felt different now, darker and more isolated than when she'd arrived. A few scattered cars remained, their owners probably employees finishing late shifts or other procrastinators like herself. Michelle settled into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror. The radio crackled to life when she turned the key, playing a soft rock ballad that made her think of the boy she'd been dating. Casually, nothing serious, just the sweet uncertainty of teenage romance. She hummed along, her breath fogging the windows as the car warmed up. The envelope of money sat on the passenger seat, a reminder of all those Saturday afternoons babysitting the neighbor kids. She'd earned every dollar of it, and part of her regretted not buying the coat. But there would be other coats, other chances. At 18, she believed she had all the time in the world. She put the car in reverse, checking her mirrors out of habit, drilled into her by countless driving lessons with her father. The parking lot seemed even emptier now, just pools of light from the overhead lamps casting long shadows between the parked cars. A movement caught her eye in the side mirror, someone walking between the cars, but she couldn't make out who it was in the darkness. Michelle wasn't particularly worried. Cedar Rapids was a safe town where neighbors looked out for each other and doors were rarely locked. Still, something made her press down the door lock, a small precaution that would prove tragically inadequate. The radio played on as she shifted into drive, planning her route home through the increasingly treacherous streets. She never made it out of the parking spot. A shadow approached her window, and Michelle's eyes widened in recognition or surprise. The last song she would ever hear was still playing when her body was discovered the next morning. Dawn broke gray and cold on the 20th of December. Michelle's father sat at the kitchen table with his morning coffee, glancing repeatedly at the clock. She should have been home hours ago. He'd heard her bedroom door close sometime after midnight, or so he thought. Now, with morning light streaming through frost-covered windows, her bed sat empty and unslept in. "She's never this late," her mother whispered, hands trembling as she dialed friends' houses. Each call brought the same response. No, Michelle had left the banquet early. No, she hadn't stopped by anyone's house. The growing panic in her mother's voice made each conversation shorter and more urgent. By 8 a.m., they called the police. The desk sergeant listened patiently. Another worried parent, another teenager who probably spent the night at a friend's house without calling. But something in the mother's voice, the certainty that this wasn't typical behavior, prompted him to send a patrol car to check the mall. Officer Jim Peterson had worked the beat for 15 years and had seen his share of false alarms. Teenagers were unpredictable, he reminded himself, as he drove through the mall parking lot. But when his flashlight beam swept across the cars near the back entrance, something made his stomach drop. A car sat alone, windows fogged from the inside, and something about it looked wrong. He approached cautiously, training taking over instinct. The driver's side window was partially down despite the freezing temperature. His flashlight beam found the interior, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his career. Michelle Martinko sat slumped against the passenger side, her blonde hair matted with blood, her choir dress torn and stained dark red. Within an hour, the mall parking lot transformed into something Cedar Rapids had never seen before. Police cars, ambulances, and detective vehicles surrounded Michelle's car like a protective barrier against the growing crowd of onlookers. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the cold wind, marking the spot where the town's innocents died along with Michelle Martinko. Detective Ray Denlinger arrived to take charge of what was clearly the most serious crime in recent memory. At 45, he'd worked robbery and assault cases, but nothing like this. The brutality was shocking. Nearly 30 stab wounds, concentrated in her chest and neck. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random attack. This was personal, violent, and methodical. "Nobody saw anything unusual last night?" he asked the mall security supervisor, a nervous man who kept glancing toward the crime scene. "We close at 10, the supervisor explained. "Most of the lot clears out by 10:30. Just employees and stragglers picking up last-minute gifts." He paused, swallowing hard. She was such a sweet kid, always polite when she came in. The crowd behind the yellow tape grew larger as word spread through the community. Neighbors who had watched Michelle grow up stood in shocked silence, many crying openly. Her high school classmates arrived in groups, holding each other as the reality set in. The girl who had been laughing and singing just hours earlier would never graduate, never go to college, never fulfill any of the bright promises her future had held. Local reporters began gathering, their presence adding to the surreal atmosphere. Cedar Rapids wasn't supposed to be the kind of place where teenage girls were murdered in mall parking lots. This was a town where the biggest crime was usually underage drinking or petty theft. The Martinko family home became a command center of grief and determination. Friends and relatives filled the living room, bringing casseroles and condolences, but the family's focus remained laser-sharp on finding Michelle's killer. Her mother, Janet, clutched a framed school photo of Michelle, the same image that would become iconic in news coverage for decades to come. "We will find who did this," Janet said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Michelle deserves justice, and we will not rest until she has it." Her husband sat in stunned silence, unable to process the violence that had claimed their daughter. The man who had worried about icy roads and teenage driving couldn't comprehend the evil that had actually ended Michelle's life. Every phone call brought false hope, friends offering condolences or tips that led nowhere. Detective Denlinger visited the family that afternoon, hat in hand and heart heavy with the burden of unsolved questions. The crime scene had yielded evidence: blood that wasn't Michelle's, signs of a struggle, and the positioning of her body that suggested she knew her attacker. But with no witnesses and no clear motive, the investigation was already proving challenging. "We're going to use every resource available," he promised the family. "This case will be our top priority for as long as it takes." Janet nodded, her grip tightening on Michelle's photograph. She would hold that same picture at every press conference, every vigil, and every plea for information over the next 39 years. It became her shield and her weapon, a constant reminder of why she would never give up the fight for justice. Christmas week 1979 felt surreal in Cedar Rapids. Houses still glowed with holiday lights, but the joy had been replaced by fear and suspicion. Neighbors who had never locked their doors began installing deadbolts. Parents kept their teenagers on strict curfews, and the mall parking lot sat nearly empty despite the season's biggest shopping days. Michelle's high school became a gathering place for grief. Her senior classmates struggled with the reality that their friend would never walk across the graduation stage with them. The choir room felt especially empty, her spot in the soprano section, a constant reminder of the voice that had been silenced forever. She was going to be something special, her choir director told a reporter, his voice breaking slightly. She had that rare combination of talent and kindness that comes along maybe once in a teacher's career. Her classmates began signing a yearbook that Michelle would never see, writing messages to their murdered friend with the awkward sincerity of teenagers facing mortality for the first time. "We'll never forget you. Save a place for us in heaven. Your killer will pay." The pages filled with promises and grief, creating a permanent record of a community's broken heart. The investigation intensified during those first critical days. Every boy Michelle had dated became a person of interest. Every classmate who'd shown romantic interest found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about their whereabouts on the 19th of December. The close-knit community began fracturing under the weight of suspicion as friends looked at friends with new and unwelcome questions. By New Year's Day, the initial burst of investigative energy was beginning to slow. No arrests had been made, and the leads were growing colder as quickly as the Iowa winter deepened. The first anniversary of Michelle's murder arrived with the same gray December sky that had witnessed her final drive. Janet Martinko stood at her daughter's grave, placing fresh poinsettias in the snow and lighting a single white candle. The flame flickered in the wind but held steady, much like her determination to find justice. "1 year, baby girl," she whispered to the headstone. "We're not giving up. We'll never give up." The investigation had settled into a frustrating routine of following leads that went nowhere. Over 300 people had been interviewed. Dozens of potential suspects had been cleared through alibis or lack of evidence. The case file grew thicker, but the answers remained elusive. Detective Denlinger had become personally invested in the case, visiting the family regularly and treating every new tip as if it might be the breakthrough they needed. But privately, he worried about the growing stack of cold cases on his desk. Resources were limited, and newer crimes demanded attention. The community had adapted to living with an unsolved murder in their midst. Parents still watched their children more closely, and the mall parking lot never quite returned to its former busy normalcy. But life moved forward because it had to. High school students graduated, families celebrated holidays, and the daily routines of small-town life gradually covered over the sharp edges of immediate grief. Only the Martinko family seemed frozen in time, marking each anniversary with the same ritual, fighting the same fight, asking the same questions that had haunted them since that terrible December morning when they learned their daughter would never come home again. The 1980s brought new investigations and renewed hope, followed by disappointment. Each potential lead followed the same pattern: initial excitement, thorough investigation, and ultimate dead ends. Janet Martinko became a familiar figure at the police station, calling weekly for updates and bringing fresh flowers for Michelle's memorial photo that now hung in the detective division. "Any news?" became her standard greeting, delivered with the same hopeful expression that gradually hardened into resigned determination over the years. Detective Denlinger, now graying and promoted to sergeant, had developed a paternal relationship with the family, understanding that his job involved not just solving the case, but managing their expectations and emotions. The investigation had expanded beyond Cedar Rapids, incorporating state and federal resources. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a psychological profile of the killer, likely a white male, probably known to Michelle, with possible mental health issues or a history of violence against women. It narrowed the suspect pool but not enough to make an arrest. New investigative techniques emerged during the decade: improved fingerprint analysis, better crime scene photography, and more sophisticated forensic methods were all applied to Michelle's case. But the evidence from that December night remained stubbornly silent. The killer had been careful or lucky, leaving behind just enough traces to prove he existed but not enough to identify him. By 1989, 10 years after Michelle's murder, the case had officially gone cold. Active investigation gave way to periodic reviews, and Detective Denlinger retired with the weight of the unsolved case heavy on his conscience. His replacement, a young detective named Matt Denlinger, no relation, inherited both the case files and the responsibility of facing the Martinko family's unwavering hope. The annual vigil at Westdale Mall became a Cedar Rapids tradition that nobody wanted to maintain but felt compelled to continue. Every the 19th of December, families gathered in the parking lot where Michelle died, holding candles and sharing memories of a girl many had never met but all had been touched by through her story. Janet Martinko organized each vigil with the dedication of someone planning a family reunion. She printed programs with Michelle's photograph, coordinated with local media, and invited speakers who could keep her daughter's memory alive. Ministers from various churches took turns offering prayers, and Michelle's high school friends, now adults with children of their own, shared stories of her kindness and dreams. "We gather not just for Michelle," Janet would tell the crowd each year, "but for every family who has lost someone to violence. We gather to say that we remember, we care, and we will never stop seeking justice." The vigils served multiple purposes beyond honoring Michelle's memory. They kept the case in the public eye, generating occasional tips that investigators dutifully followed. They provided comfort to other families, dealing with unsolved crimes, creating a community of shared grief and determination. Most importantly, they demonstrated to Michelle's killer that his crime had not been forgotten. Local news stations covered each vigil, often featuring updates on the investigation's status. The stories became shorter and less prominent as years passed, but they never disappeared entirely. Michelle's case had become part of Cedar Rapids' identity, a reminder of vulnerability in a place that prided itself on safety and community values. By the vigil's 20th anniversary, some wondered if it was time to let Michelle rest in peace. Janet Martinko's response was always the same: when her killer is behind bars. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: new technology and old evidence. In 2006, Detective Matt Denlinger was reviewing cold cases when he noticed something in Michelle's file that previous investigators had noted but couldn't fully utilize. Blood evidence from Michelle's dress had been carefully preserved, waiting for the day when science might catch up to justice. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigations since Michelle's murder, but the technology required relatively fresh samples and significant amounts of genetic material. The blood on Michelle's dress was nearly 30 years old and contaminated by time and storage conditions. Still, advances in extraction and amplification techniques made testing possible where it hadn't been before. The process took months. Samples went to the state crime lab, then to the FBI's laboratory in Virginia when local resources proved insufficient. Each step brought cautious hope from the Martinko family and careful management of expectations from investigators who had seen too many false dawns in this case. Finally, the call came. A partial DNA profile had been successfully extracted from the evidence. It wasn't Michelle's blood, and it wasn't degraded beyond use. For the first time in 27 years, investigators had a genetic fingerprint of Michelle's killer. The profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the national DNA database that cross-references genetic evidence from crime scenes with samples from convicted criminals. The computer search ran automatically, comparing the unknown profile against millions of known samples. The result was devastating in its simplicity: no matches found. "We have his DNA," Detective Denlinger explained to the family. "Now we just need to find him." The wait, it seemed, would continue, but at least now they knew they were waiting for something concrete rather than chasing shadows. The disappointment of the failed CODIS match settled over the investigation like a familiar weight. Having DNA evidence felt like progress, but without a match in the criminal database, it was simply another piece of a puzzle with no clear solution. The partial profile sat in computer systems, waiting for a day when the killer might be arrested for another crime and compelled to provide a DNA sample. Janet Martinko received the news with the same quiet strength she'd shown for nearly 3 decades. At 68, she moved more slowly, but with undiminished purpose. The basement of her home had become an informal command center for Michelle's case, with filing cabinets full of correspondence with investigators, boxes of newspaper clippings, and photographs from years of vigils and press conferences. "At least now we know something," she told reporters who gathered for her reaction to the DNA development. "We know he's still out there, and someday, somehow, this evidence will bring him to justice." The case attracted attention from cold case specialists and amateur investigators who had begun following unsolved crimes online. True crime forums dissected every detail of Michelle's murder, generating new theories and occasionally useful tips. The family welcomed the interest, understanding that publicity kept the case alive in ways that official investigation alone couldn't achieve. Detective Denlinger continued working the case alongside his active caseload, reviewing tips and following up on leads that seemed promising. Most went nowhere, but he understood that solving cold cases often required patience and persistence rather than breakthrough moments. Somewhere, Michelle's killer was living his life, possibly unaware that science had finally identified him genetically, even if it couldn't yet name him. In 2017, nearly 4 decades after Michelle's murder, technology offered a new avenue for investigation. DNA phenotyping had evolved from science fiction to forensic reality, allowing laboratories to predict physical characteristics based solely on genetic evidence. Detective Denlinger, now a veteran investigator himself, authorized the expensive process with the hope that it might generate new leads. The phenotype analysis took months and required sending evidence to a specialized laboratory in Virginia. Scientists analyzed the preserved DNA sample for markers associated with physical traits: eye color, hair color, skin tone, facial structure, and even patterns of aging. The process was imprecise but had proven successful in other cold cases around the country. The results arrived as both a detailed report and an artist's rendering based on the genetic predictions. Michelle's killer was likely a white male with brown hair and brown eyes, medium build, and distinctive facial features that could be aged from his appearance in 1979 to his probable current age. The sketch was haunting a face that could belong to any middle-aged man in Cedar Rapids. This could be our neighbor, our coworker, someone we see at the grocery store. Detective Denlinger told the media when releasing the phenotype sketch. This person has been living among us for 40 years, and now we have a face to go with his DNA. The sketch circulated widely through social media and local news coverage, generating hundreds of tips from people who thought they recognized the face. Each tip required investigation, and each investigation led to elimination of another potential suspect. But the sketch had done something important. It transformed Michelle's killer from an abstract concept into a real person with identifiable features who could be recognized and reported. The revolution came quietly in 2018, through a genealogy website that most people use to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. GEDmatch had become an unexpected tool for law enforcement, allowing investigators to upload crime scene DNA profiles and search against family trees, uploaded by curious citizens exploring their heritage. Detective Denlinger had heard about the technique through training courses and professional networks. The Golden State Killer case had recently demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy, using public DNA databases to identify a serial killer who had evaded capture for decades. If it worked for California, it might work for Iowa. The process required careful legal consideration and collaboration with genetic genealogy specialists. Michelle's killer's DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch in January 2018, and the search began immediately. Unlike CODIS, which required exact matches with convicted criminals, genetic genealogy looked for partial matches with any uploaded DNA sample, then built family trees to identify potential suspects. The first hit came within weeks, a distant relative, perhaps a third or fourth cousin, whose family tree could be traced back several generations. Investigators working with genealogy experts began building a comprehensive family tree, identifying branches that might contain Michelle's killer. The process was methodical and time-consuming, requiring verification of birth records, marriage certificates, and family relationships going back over a century. By summer 2018, the family tree had narrowed to a handful of potential suspects, all men of the right age living in Iowa. One name kept appearing at the intersection of multiple family branches: Jerry Lynn Burns, a businessman from Manchester, Iowa, about an hour from Cedar Rapids. His age, location, and family connections made him a compelling candidate for further investigation. Jerry Lynn Burns had lived an unremarkable life in plain sight. At 64, he owned a powder coating business, had raised a family, and participated in community activities with the low-key presence of someone who preferred anonymity. Nothing in his background suggested violence or criminal behavior, but genetic genealogy had placed him at the intersection of family lines that could produce Michelle Martinko's killer. Investigators faced a delicate challenge: how to obtain a DNA sample from Burns without alerting him to their suspicions or violating his civil rights. The solution came through patient surveillance and an understanding of public DNA collection laws. If Burns discarded DNA in a public place, investigators could legally collect and test it without a warrant. The opportunity came at a truck stop restaurant where Burns occasionally ate lunch. Investigators conducting surveillance watched him order coffee and a sandwich, consuming both while reading a newspaper at a corner table. When he finished eating and prepared to leave, he discarded his drinking straw in the restaurant's trash can. Detective Denlinger and his team waited until Burns left, then collected the straw using proper evidence handling procedures. The sample went immediately to the state crime lab with instructions for rush processing. After nearly 4 decades of waiting, the investigation suddenly moved at lightning speed. The DNA results came back within days, a perfect match to the evidence from Michelle Martinko's dress. After 39 years of searching, investigators had finally identified her killer. Jerry Lynn Burns, family man and business owner, had been hiding in plain sight since the 19th of December, 1979. The legal and logistical preparations for arrest began immediately, coordinated between multiple agencies and prosecutors who understood the magnitude of finally solving Cedar Rapids' most notorious cold case. The 19th of December, 2018, 39 years to the day after Michelle Martinko's murder, investigators prepared for the arrest they had dreamed of for nearly 4 decades. The timing was intentional, a message to the Martinko family and the Cedar Rapids community that justice had not forgotten Michelle's story. Jerry Lynn Burns was at his business when officers arrived, working in his office like any other Wednesday morning. He looked up from his desk as Detective Denlinger and two other investigators entered, their expressions grim and purposeful. Something in their demeanor must have told him this wasn't a routine visit. "Mr. Burns, I'm Detective Denlinger with the Cedar Rapids Police Department. We need to talk to you about Michelle Martinko." The color drained from Burns's face at the mention of Michelle's name. For a moment, the office fell silent except for the hum of machinery from the plant floor. Burns said nothing, but his reaction spoke volumes to investigators who had spent years learning to read suspects' responses. "You're under arrest for the murder of Michelle Martinko," Detective Denlinger continued, reading Burns his Miranda rights as other officers moved into position. The arrest was quiet and professional, without drama or resistance. Burns walked to the police car with the resigned posture of someone who had always known this day might come. News of the arrest spread through Cedar Rapids like wildfire. Social media posts, phone calls, and text messages carried the stunning news. After nearly 4 decades, Michelle's killer had been caught. The arrest made national news, but in Cedar Rapids, it felt personal and profound. A wound that had never healed suddenly had the possibility of closure. The revelation that Jerry Lynn Burns was Michelle Martinko's killer sent shockwaves through his community in Manchester, Iowa. Neighbors who had known him for years struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the brutal crime he was accused of committing. He had coached Little League, attended church functions, and run a successful business without ever arousing suspicion. "Jerry, there's no way," said one neighbor who had known the family for over 20 years. "He helped me move furniture last summer. We talked about grandchildren and fishing. He seemed like the most normal guy you could imagine." But as investigators revealed details of their case, a different picture began to emerge. Burns had lived just 1 county away from Cedar Rapids in 1979, close enough to know the area and the mall where Michelle was killed. He had no alibi for the 19th of December, 1979, and his own family couldn't account for his whereabouts that night. The business he owned provided another potential connection. Burns' powder coating operation served customers throughout eastern Iowa, including Cedar Rapids. He would have been familiar with the area, the roads, and possibly even the mall where Michelle died. The geographic connections that had seemed insignificant for decades suddenly became crucial elements of the case against him. Most disturbing was the realization that Burns had been hiding in plain sight for 39 years, living a normal life, while Michelle's family suffered through decades of grief and uncertainty. Every Christmas vigil, every news story, every plea for information had been conducted while her killer lived peacefully in a community that trusted and accepted him. The call came to Janet Martinko's house at 2:47 p.m. on the 19th of December, 2018. Detective Denlinger's voice was steady but emotional as he delivered the news the family had waited 39 years to hear. "We've made an arrest in Michelle's case. We got him." Janet sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd received so many disappointing updates over the years. At 79, she had never given up hope, but had sometimes wondered if she would live to see justice for her daughter. Now, on the exact anniversary of Michelle's death, that justice was finally within reach. Her husband, now in his 80s and frail from years of carrying grief, wept openly when she shared the news. They had grown old together in the shadow of their daughter's murder, their lives forever altered by that December night in 1979. The arrest couldn't restore Michelle or give them back the decades of pain, but it offered something they had nearly stopped believing in, the possibility of closure. Phone calls went out to family members, close friends, and the network of supporters who had sustained the Martinko family through nearly 4 decades of waiting. Each conversation carried the same mixture of relief, vindication, and sorrow. Michelle was still gone, but her killer would finally face justice. "I wish Michelle could know," Janet told a reporter who called for her reaction to the arrest. "I wish she could know that we never gave up, that we never stopped fighting for her. Today, for the first time in 39 years, I feel like we can rest. Not because the fight is over, but because we finally won." February 2020 brought Michelle Martinko's case to trial, drawing spectators from across Iowa and beyond. The courtroom in Lynn County was packed each day with family members, former investigators, high school classmates now in their late 50s, and true crime enthusiasts who had followed the case for years. It was standing room only for one of Iowa's most notorious cold case prosecutions. Jerry Lynn Burns sat at the defense table with the same quiet demeanor he'd displayed at his arrest. At 65, he looked like any grandfather who might be spending his retirement fishing or playing with grandchildren. The contrast between his appearance and the brutal crime he was accused of committing was jarring for everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys who understood the historical significance of the case, methodically presented their evidence. DNA statistics showing the astronomical odds against anyone but Burns being Michelle's killer. Genealogy experts explaining how family trees had led investigators to their suspect. Crime scene evidence that had waited 4 decades for technology to catch up to justice. Most powerfully, they presented Michelle herself through testimony from family and friends who painted a picture of a vibrant teenager whose life had been cut short by senseless violence. Her choir director, now retired, described her talent and ambition. Classmates shared memories of her kindness and the dreams she would never fulfill. Janet Martinko, now 80, held Michelle's senior portrait as she testified about 39 years of grief and determination. The defense faced an almost impossible task, explaining away DNA evidence that prosecutors claimed made Burns's guilt virtually certain. They suggested contamination, questioned the chain of custody, and proposed alternative theories, but the scientific evidence seemed overwhelming. The prosecution's DNA expert took the stand on day 3 of the trial, armed with charts, graphs, and statistics that would prove crucial to the case against Jerry Lynn Burns. The evidence was complex, but damning. The probability that someone other than Burns had left the blood on Michelle's dress was approximately 1 in 100 billion. To put that in perspective, the expert explained to the jury, there are only about 7.8 billion people on Earth. The odds against this DNA belonging to someone other than Mr. Burns are more than 10 times the entire population of our planet. The defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, questioning the age of the evidence, the storage conditions, and the reliability of DNA analysis on samples nearly 4 decades old. But the science had advanced dramatically since Michelle's murder, and the testing procedures had been thorough and well documented. Jerry Lynn Burns watched impassively as the evidence mounted against him. He had declined to testify in his own defense, leaving his attorney to argue reasonable doubt without the benefit of his client's explanation for how his DNA had come to be on Michelle's clothing. The silence was deafening. Janet Martinko sat in the front row throughout the DNA testimony, finally hearing scientific confirmation of what she had believed for 39 years. Someone had killed her daughter, and that someone was sitting just 20 feet away in the defendant's chair. The numbers on the charts represented more than statistics, they represented truth, finally revealed after decades of uncertainty. The jury listened intently to testimony that many of them struggled to fully comprehend. DNA analysis was foreign to most people, but the expert's explanation made the evidence accessible. This wasn't complicated science, it was simple math. Burns's DNA was on Michelle's dress, and no one else could have put it there. When Janet Martinko took the witness stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. At 80 years old, she moved slowly but with unmistakable dignity, carrying Michelle's senior portrait that had become her constant companion through 4 decades of seeking justice. Her voice was clear and strong as she raised her right hand to take the oath. "Tell us about Michelle," the prosecutor said gently, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of a lifetime of advocacy. Janet's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. She spoke about Michelle's dreams of college, her love of music, her kindness to younger students. She described the Christmas coat that Michelle had been saving for, the babysitting money found untouched in her purse, the future that had been stolen in a mall parking lot. She was 18 years old, Janet said, her voice never wavering despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was going to be a teacher, maybe get married, give us grandchildren. All of that was taken away in one night by the man sitting over there. For the first time during the trial, Janet Martinko looked directly at Jerry Lynn Burns. Her gaze was unwavering, neither angry nor hateful, but absolutely certain. This was the moment she had waited 39 years for, the chance to look her daughter's killer in the eye and speak for Michelle one final time. "I made a promise to my daughter that we would find who did this," she continued. "I kept that promise. Today, I can finally tell Michelle that justice is coming." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and respectful, understanding that attacking a grieving mother would only hurt their case with the jury. The jury retired to deliberate on the 24th of February, 2020, carrying the weight of nearly 4 decades of community pain and family grief. 12 citizens of Lynn County, most of them too young to remember Michelle's murder when it happened, would decide whether Jerry Lynn Burns would spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime committed before some of them were born. The deliberation room was stark and functional, equipped with tables, chairs, and boxes of evidence that represented thousands of hours of investigation. The DNA charts dominated one wall, their statistical certainty standing in stark contrast to the human complexity of the case. The jurors had heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, examined photographs that some would never forget, and listened to scientific explanations that challenged their understanding of how justice could be served after so many years. The foreperson, a retired teacher who remembered the fear that gripped Cedar Rapids in 1979, organized the discussion methodically. They reviewed the evidence piece by piece, the DNA match, the genealogy investigation, Burns's lack of alibi, and his reaction when arrested. They discussed reasonable doubt and the burden of proof, understanding that their decision would affect not just Burns and his family, but the Martinko family and an entire community that had waited for closure. Outside the courthouse, media crews and spectators maintained their vigil, some having followed the case for decades. Janet Martinko waited in a family room, surrounded by relatives and friends who had supported her through the longest fight of her life. After 39 years of active investigation and advocacy, she could only wait for 12 strangers to validate everything she had believed about her daughter's murder. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. The bailiff's call for "all rise" brought the packed courtroom to its feet in a rustle of nervous energy and held breath. Judge Faye Hoover took her seat and asked the foreperson if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The piece of paper that passed from jury foreperson to bailiff to judge contained a single word that would end one of Iowa's longest-running criminal investigations. Judge Hoover unfolded the verdict form, read it silently, and then looked out over the courtroom that had become a symbol of persistence and hope. "Has the jury reached a verdict as to the charge of murder in the first degree?" "Yes, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Jerry Lynn Burns, guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted in gasps, tears, and whispered prayers. Janet Martinko collapsed into the arms of her family, sobbing with relief that seemed to carry the weight of 39 years. Behind her, Michelle's former classmates wept openly, finally able to grieve properly for their friend. Even veteran investigators who had worked the case felt tears streaming down their faces. Jerry Lynn Burns showed no visible reaction to the verdict, maintaining the same emotionless expression he had displayed throughout the trial. His family members, who had steadfastly maintained his innocence, sat in stunned silence as their worst fears were confirmed. Judge Hoover restored order to the courtroom and thanked the jury for their service in one of the most challenging cases in county history. The formal sentencing would come later, but everyone present understood that Burns would spend the rest of his life in prison for Michelle Martinko's murder. The 7th of August, 2020, brought the final chapter of the legal proceedings against Jerry Lynn Burns. The sentencing hearing drew the same crowds as the trial, with the Martinko family once again filling the front rows of the courtroom. Janet Martinko, now 81 and using a walker, carried Michelle's photograph as she had for every major moment in the case. Judge Hoover had reviewed the pre-sentence investigation, victim impact statements, and legal arguments from both sides. Iowa law provided little discretion for first-degree murder convictions, life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the judge understood that her words would carry significance beyond the legal requirements. "Mr. Burns," Judge Hoover addressed the defendant directly, "you have been convicted of one of the most heinous crimes this community has ever experienced. For nearly 4 decades, you lived freely while the Martinko family endured unimaginable grief and an entire community lived in fear. Your actions on the 19th of December, 1979, changed countless lives forever." Burns was given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing. He declined, maintaining the silence he had kept throughout the investigation and trial. His refusal to explain, apologize, or show any remorse added to the courtroom's sense that justice was incomplete, even as it was finally being served. "The court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," Judge Hoover announced. "You will spend the remainder of your life in the custody of the Iowa Department of Corrections." As Burns was led away in shackles, Janet Martinko whispered words that only her family could hear. "We did it, Michelle. We finally did it." After 39 years, 2 months, and 19 days, Michelle Martinko's case was officially closed. The weeks following Burns's sentencing brought an outpouring of support and remembrance that surprised even the Martinko family. Michelle's grave at Oak Hill Cemetery became a pilgrimage site for people who wanted to pay their respects to a girl they had never met but whose story had touched their lives. Flowers, cards, and small tokens covered the headstone as strangers felt compelled to honor her memory. Local florists reported running out of white roses, Michelle's favorite flower, as people from across Iowa and beyond made the journey to Cedar Rapids. The cemetery had to assign extra staff to manage the crowds and maintain the dignity of the burial ground while accommodating the hundreds of visitors who came each day. "I never expected this," Janet Martinko told a reporter as she visited Michelle's grave on a sunny September morning. "Michelle touched so many lives even though hers was cut short. Seeing all this love and support makes me believe that her death wasn't in vain if it brought people together and showed them the importance of never giving up." The case had indeed become something larger than a single family's tragedy. It represented hope for other families dealing with unsolved crimes, proof that justice could be served even after decades of waiting. Cold case investigators from around the country had studied the genealogy techniques used to identify Burns, applying similar methods to their own unsolved cases. Michelle's story had also become a testament to the power of maternal love and determination. Janet Martinko's refusal to let her daughter be forgotten had kept the case alive when official resources were limited. Her decades of advocacy had created a community of supporters who ensured that Michelle's name was never forgotten. The 19th of December, 2020, marked the 41st anniversary of Michelle Martinko's murder and the first vigil held after her killer's conviction. The annual gathering at Westdale Mall had a different feeling this year. Instead of seeking justice, the community had gathered to celebrate its achievement and honor Michelle's memory in a new way. The crowd was smaller than in previous years, but the attendees included many of the people who had sustained the fight for justice through 4 decades. Former investigators, retired reporters, high school classmates, and dozens of people who had simply refused to let Michelle be forgotten gathered in the parking lot where her life had ended so violently. Janet Martinko, now requiring assistance to stand for long periods, spoke to the crowd with a voice that carried both exhaustion and satisfaction. "For 40 years, we gathered here asking for justice," she said, holding Michelle's photograph one last time at a public vigil. "Tonight, we gather to say thank you to everyone who remembered Michelle, who shared her story, who never stopped believing that this day would come." The vigil included new elements that reflected the case's resolution. Instead of asking for tips or leads, speakers focused on Michelle's life and dreams. Her choir director, now in his 80s, led the group in singing "Amazing Grace," the song Michelle had been practicing for the Christmas concert she would never attend. As the candles were lit and the evening grew cold, many attendees understood that this would be the last traditional vigil for Michelle Martinko. Her story would continue to be told, but the desperate search for justice had finally ended. The community could remember her now, not as a victim seeking justice, but as a young woman whose life had mattered and whose death had brought people together in extraordinary ways. In the months following the trial's conclusion, Janet Martinko began the bittersweet task of organizing 40 years of memories, documents, and photographs related to Michelle's case. The basement command center that had served as headquarters for their quest for justice slowly transformed into a memorial archive that would preserve the story for future generations. The photo albums told an incredible story of persistence and community support. Pictures from the earliest vigils showed young faces that had grown old during the decades-long fight for justice. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age documented every development in the case, from the initial investigation through the genealogy breakthrough that finally identified Burns. Most poignant were the photographs of Janet herself, aging gracefully but determinedly through 40 years of advocacy. In the earliest pictures, she appeared as a devastated mother clutching her daughter's senior portrait. By the final images from the trial, she had become an elderly woman whose face showed the weight of years but whose eyes still burned with the fire that had sustained her through the longest fight of her life. Michelle would be 59 years old now, Janet reflected as she organized the materials. She might have had children, grandchildren, a career that made a difference in the world. "I can't give her back her future, but I can make sure her story is never forgotten." The archive would eventually be donated to the Cedar Rapids Public Library, where researchers and true crime enthusiasts could study one of Iowa's most significant cold case investigations. More importantly, it would serve as inspiration for other families facing similar tragedies, proof that justice is possible even when it seems impossibly distant. The final chapter of Michelle Martinko's story wasn't written in a courtroom or a newspaper, but in the quiet moments when justice allowed healing to begin. Janet Martinko lived to see her 92nd birthday, spending her final years at peace with the knowledge that she had kept her promise to her daughter. She passed away in her sleep on a winter morning in 2023, exactly 44 years after Michelle's murder, with her daughter's photograph on the nightstand beside her. Jerry Lynn Burns remained in prison, maintaining his silence about the events of the 19th of December, 1979. His refusal to explain or apologize became part of his legacy, leaving questions that would never be answered about motive and planning. The community of Manchester gradually adjusted to the reality that they had known a killer for decades, while Cedar Rapids found peace in finally knowing who had shattered their sense of security so many years earlier. Michelle's story became a textbook case study in genetic genealogy and cold case investigation, taught in police academies and forensic science programs across the country. Her case helped solve dozens of other cold cases as investigators applied similar techniques to evidence that had waited decades for technology to catch up to justice. Most importantly, Michelle Martinko was remembered not as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had meaning beyond her tragic death. Her story inspired legislation strengthening victims' rights, funding for cold case investigations, and support for families dealing with unsolved crimes. The girl who had planned to be a teacher ended up educating people about justice, persistence, and the power of never giving up hope. On quiet December evenings in Cedar Rapids, when snow falls gently on empty mall parking lots and Christmas lights glow in windows throughout the city, Michelle Martinko's presence can still be felt. Not as a ghost or a tragedy, but as a reminder that truth has its own timeline and justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail.